Hello and welcome to a millinery hat making video. My name is Ilona, I'm a milliner based in London, and today I'm going to show you how to make 5 stylish pillbox hat variations. I'll start with a beginner-friendly open top model, and every hat after that will build on the previously mentioned techniques. Just remember, there is no right or wrong way, it's whatever works for you. Let's gather the materials and get started. I'd like to introduce you to some millinery materials that I will be using today. This is Buckram, and it's my favourite foundation material. It is an open weave cotton covered in a thick starchy paste that makes it stiff when dry and pliable when damp. Buckram can also be made out of linen or hemp. This is millinery wire. It is a wire that is sometimes copper, sometimes steel. It is coated in cotton or silk thread. The thread covering makes it easier to work with, and my wire is 1 millimeter thick. And here is some galvanized wire, which you can use as a substitute if you can't find any millinery wire. What about the fabrics? You'll notice that Buckram is quite lumpy and bumpy, and you shouldn't put your fashion fabric straight over the Buckram, otherwise its texture will come through and the hat will turn out bumpy. To prevent this, you'll need to protect your Buckram with some Domet fabric. I believe in America this is sometimes called icewool. It's a soft, fleecy fabric that is perfect for smoothing over hard Buckram surfaces. My Domet is fusible, but plain, non-fusible Domet will do just fine. If you can't find Domet, you can use some thin cotton wadding instead. What's the best fabric to use in pillboxes? There isn't one. Any fabric goes. However, some cult favourites are wool tweeds, boucles and houndstooths, as well as silk velvets, cottons, and the list is never ending. Today, I will be using this boucle wool on one of my favourite pillbox models. These are some offcuts from a skirt I made myself. Boucle is a woolen fabric that has little loops running through it. In my particular example, the loops are formed out of white and red fibres, while the rest of the weave is made up of oranges and yellows. It gives it a soft apricot colour when you look at it from a distance. I will also be using silk velvet. 100% silk velvet is very difficult to find and super expensive. Instead, I recommend you use a silk and viscose velvet mix. This one is 20% silk and 80% viscose. You can also use cotton velvet, although it doesn't have a shine and it's much stiffer, so getting a nice drape from it is difficult. And I implore you to stay away from polyester velvet. Polyester is essentially a plastic, which is very harmful to our environment. Let's all work together for a better future and use natural fibres where possible. Right, now you know all about the millinery foundation materials and fashion fabrics, let's get hatting.
Pillbox number 1 is a beginner-friendly model. You just need to be proficient at hand sewing. This type of pillbox is known as an open top because, well, it doesn't have a tip on top. For a comprehensive list of tools and materials, please see the description box. To achieve this design, get your buckram and cut out a strip on the bias. This strip can be of any width plus 3 cm and any length plus 3 cm. Feel free to experiment with the height and length you want using paper. Why is it on the bias? Well, the bias in millinery is sacred, and if you'd like to find out more about it, I've linked to a video in the top right. Next, you'll need to get out your wire and cut 2 lengths the same as your buckram length plus 2 cm. Position your wires 1.5 cm from the top and bottom of your strips. Stitch them in place using a wire stitch. If you don't know how to do a wire stitch, I go over this in the video I've linked in the top right. Now I'm going to join up the ends of the buckram and wire. You should have a 3 cm overlap on the buckram and a 5 cm overlap on the wires. I know this looks weird, but this is just one way of doing this. The other way would have been to join your wires into circles before stitching them into the ring of buckram. Stitch the buckram join using cross stitches. And then also secure the wire overlap to the buckram using the same wire stitches we did earlier. Bend the buckram over the wires and stitch it in place using basting stitches. Next, add some Domet or whatever you are using as an interlining. My Domet is also cut on the bias, and I've cut it twice as wide as my finished hat height plus 1.5 centimeters. I'm covering the inside and outside of my buckram. You can choose to only cover the outside if this is easier for you. Now let's turn to the velvet. I've cut it out yet again on the bias. It is the width of the finished height of my hat times 3 plus 3 centimeters. The extra height is for a drape, but you can choose to cover your pillbox tightly and without a drape. The length is the final length circumference of my pillbox plus 3 centimeters. I find that it is easier to cut velvet the wrong side up. That way I can tell if I'm accurately following the true bias. Now stitch the ends together using a running stitch. You can do this by hand or on a sewing machine. Steam this join gently open. Very gently steam a fold into the velvet 1.5 centimeters from the top. Don't press the velvet with your iron too hard or you will crush the nap. This fold will be the joining seam for the inside of your pillbox ring. Stitch it down close to the edge using a running or basting stitch. I am going to position my seam at the front as I will cover it in a pretty velvet knot later. If you don't want your trim at the centre front, then put your seam wherever you plan to put your trimming. We'll have a chat about these options later. Next comes the hard part. Fold the velvet over the top of the buckram and pin down the folded side over the bit you've already stitched. Here you will have to use invisible slip stitches to stitch everything down. To execute the drape, run a gathering stitch either side of your joining seam. Then pull on the thread to create a gather. Use a few tacking stitches to hold it all in place. Be careful not to stitch through the velvet on the inside of the hat. You might find that you need to hold the drape in a few more places other than just at the seam. I've put a few more gathers in at equal intervals at the sides. Once it's all stitched down, the pillbox is ready for trimming. As I've already mentioned, trim placement will depend on where you've put your seam. As I've put mine at the front, I'm going to use a spare piece of bias velvet to drape into a fake knot. If you are enjoying this video, please consider liking and subscribing. This really helps me grow and reach a larger audience. As for the head fastening, I'm going to add a comb. I've bound the edge in yet another piece of bias velvet as this makes it easier to sew on. I could leave it as it is, or I could trim it further with some veiling. What do you think? Is the veiling too much? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to know your opinion.
Congratulations, you've just made a vintage style open crown pillbox. As promised, let's talk trimmings. I absolutely love symmetrical centered hats, so I've chosen to place my trim right at the center of my forehead. But what if that's not your thing? It can also go on the back, and in that case, it doesn't have to be a knot. It can be a pretty bow or a delicate flower. If you'd like to know how to make a silk organza rose or a cotton organdy poppy just like these, I've linked to my video on that in the top right. Is symmetry at the back still not for you? That's okay. Place your trim on the side, just at the point where your eyebrow arches or ends. You'll have to put the hat on your head, determine what looks best, pin it in place and tack it down. You can still have a bow or a flower, or how about a pretty little pick of romantic berries? You can also go down the vintage route. let's say that you've decided to cover your open-top pillbox in silk satin. A great choice. Follow the same order of operations as with the velvet and it will turn out just darling. How would you trim the satin? Well, you can cover it with bows all the way around. You could also cover it in some veiling and put some little crystals, chenilles, or even mini bows all the way around. I think it will look super cute. And here are some more vintage variations. Make the buckram band super thin and have the bows do all the work. You're kind of crossing into wireframe hat territory here, and that's a whole other video. You can either figure that out yourself, or if you'd like to see me give it a go, let me know in the comments. Let's move on to pillbox number 2.
This pillbox has a flat top. You already know how to make a Domet covered wired buckram ring, as we've just done that in the previous section of this video. The only difference is that this time I am not basting down the bottom buckram flap. You'll see why this is later on. You'll need to cut out a circle for your flat top. Make sure it has a 1.5 cm seam running around it, and it needs to be just smaller than the inside circumference of your buckram ring. I am making mine a perfect circle, but you can make yours an oval if you wish. Silly me forgot to turn the camera on to film the cutting and sewing of the fabric, but all this is just a bias strip of cotton overlaid with a bias strip of white silk organza. It is the height of my buckram ring plus 3 cm. I have ironed in a crease 1.5 cm from the top and given it a straight seam down the back. I've got the same cotton overlaid with the same organza for the top. I'm pinning it down to the top of the hat using very fine entomology pins so as not to damage the silk. Then I'm going to stitch it down using a simple backstitch. You can also use a running stitch if you prefer. Notice that I am wearing a thimble. This is always advisable for hand sewing, especially in millinery to protect your fingers. Mine is a leather one that I made myself, and I know that I'm technically wearing it on the wrong finger. But this is how I prefer it, and you can also do whatever makes you feel comfortable. Next, to attach the side band. First, I'm going to position it in place with the fold in the fabric exactly where I want it. But before sewing it down, I'm going to flip the fabric up and then repin it all in place. Then, place the stitches about 3 or 5 mm down from the fold. This will make them totally invisible on the right side of the hat. This time I'm using stab stitches to make sure there is as little thread as possible on the outside of the hat. Once you're done with that, flip the fabric back down over the sides and pin it to the bottom flap of buckram. I find this bit super clever when it comes to making pillboxes, as none of your stitches will show on the outside of the hat. Pin everything in place and tack everything down. You can use a running stitch or a stab stitch, it really doesn't matter, as we will be stitching more things onto this same section later to hold everything in place. This will only work with a natural fibre Petersham ribbon. A polyester grosgrain will not do. Curve it into a C shape. This will allow it to sit nice and flat on the inside of the pillbox. Right, we're almost done. Now for the fastening. Just like for the last hat, I'm binding the edge of my comb, but this time it's with a ribbon. And here's a genius tip. Cover the teeth of the comb in some masking tape so that your thread doesn't get tangled as you sew. This makes the sewing so much easier and faster. Before sewing in the ribbon, I'm going to sew in another type of fastening. This is called crisp veiling ribbon. I have matched it to my hair colour, and when I wear the hat, I put cross bobby pins through it and it really glues the hat to my head. You can also use crin or any other material that has a netted structure. Now for the curved Petersham ribbon. Pin it to the outer curve of the pillbox edge. It needs to be placed about 5 mm down from the bend of the buckram ring. This Petersham will hide the raw edges of the fabric underneath. I am using invisible stab stitches to tack it down, and I've made sure to position my join right at the centre back.
You can stop here if you are making the pillbox for yourself, or you can be super fancy and put in a lining. If you'd like to know how to do that, this part of the video is available through my Patreon. I currently have 2 tiers through which you can support my videos, and both of them include more content and the ability to ask me questions directly. For more details, follow the links in the description box. I have also set up a Ko-fi tipping account. Video production is expensive, and while I would love to carry on offering up millinery techniques for free, it's the video production part of things that I need a little help funding. So with your tips here and there, I will be able to continue producing high-quality hat content for you all. Once again, follow the links in the description box for more information. As for variations with this hat, you can make it an oval. It doesn't have to be a perfect circle. Use any kind of fabric you want, and I will say that using thicker woven fabrics such as wools and tweeds is much easier to sew than delicate cottons and silks. But we'll talk about this more in the next section. And of course, this shape is perfect for using up sewing project offcuts, especially if you like the matchy-matchy look. For the trimmings, I have decided to leave mine plain, as I really like the simple angular shape and how it harmonizes with the clean fabrics. But if you really wanted to hide the seam at the centre back, you can put a bow on it. A structured bow made out of crin would work really well, as would an interfaced bow made out of a matching fabric.
For the next pillbox, you'll need to start with yet another Domet covered wired buckram ring. This one is also going to be a perfectly round pillbox, except this time we're adding a domed top. Once I have completed all the buckram ring steps, just like from the previous 2 pillboxes, I'm going to attach my boucle fashion fabric. As I am using fabric offcuts from a skirt I made myself, I don't have a lot of fabric to work with. There isn't enough to cut it on the bias, so it will have to do with being on the straight grain. Sewing boucle, tweed, or any other thick woolen fabric consisting of lots of multicoloured thread is really easy. I don't have to worry too much about hiding my stitches, as they will disappear in the fibres of the fabric. However, I am still going to use little tiny stab stitches on the outside of the fabric, just in case. This time I haven't joined my fabric into a ring on the sewing machine, as boucle or tweed is very thick and it is easier to join it together once it is pinned and sewn onto the base ring. Now let's make a domed top. Cut out a perfect circle of buckram that will fit inside your buckram ring. To dome the circle, I will be using a Poupee Head, but if you don't have one, you can use anything domed in your house, bowls or flower pots included. I have in the past used sofa cushions that I taped together to keep a domed shape. But I do suggest you buy a Poupee Head if you don't have one, as I have found mine to be indispensable. And you can always use it to display your finished hat on once you're done making it. To shape the buckram, put a pin into the centre to keep it in place. And also pin down the top, bottom and sides at the straight grain. Then, using either your steamer or a steam iron, shape the buckram until it conforms to the curves. Don't let it get any folds. Make sure that it is nice and smooth. Once it's dry, you'll need to check it's the right fit for the inside of your buckram ring. Make sure you accommodate for the thickness of your fabric. Your domed circle may need to be smaller than you think. Then you'll need to wire it. This time I have joined the wires to form a circle first. I go over on how to do this in more detail in the wiring video that I have linked to. Then cover your wired dome in Domet, folding over all the edges. Now you need to cover it in your fashion fabric. Stitch it down using invisible stab stitches just like before. You get to decide on how you want the fabric to sit. You can either accentuate strong straight lines by keeping them on the grain, or you can rotate it by 45 degrees and have it sit on the bias. On a previous iteration of my boucle business model, I decided to keep them straight. but on this orange one I think it looks better on the bias angle. Once the tip and side band are covered with the fashion fabric, it's time to join them together. You can position the dome tip right at the top of your side band, but I think this design looks better with a slight lip. I've positioned mine about 1 centimeter below the top of my side band. To stitch everything together, I'm using a V-shaped stitch. I don't know if there is a technical term for this. If you know of one, let me know in the comments. The way this V-stitch goes is like this. Put a stab stitch through the side band. Then put a stab stitch through the top. Then a stab stitch through the side band again and work your way around all the circumference. The threads should form large V shapes along the underedge of the dome top. We're almost done, we just need to think about a fastening and a lining. Once again, I'm sewing in some netted ribbon, but you can choose to put in an elastic if you feel more comfortable with that. The lining for this one is slightly different to the flat top pillbox as we have a dome to navigate. If you'd like to see how I domed and sewed the lining, that part of the video is available to view through my Patreon. You can find the details of how to join in the description box. This type of hat works perfectly as part of a matching outfit. I'm wearing it with a matching skirt I made using boucle wool fabric woven by Linton Tweeds. This is the same fabric mill that Chanel commissioned to make their famous one-of-a-kind fabrics.
Moving on to the next pillbox, we are headed to advanced territory here. You'll need a blocked Buckram pillbox shape for this one. If you'd like to know how to block Buckram, I've linked to my video on how to do this at the top right. And if you don't have a blocked pillbox, there is no reason why you can't apply this kind of fabric covering technique to any of the previous pillbox styles that I have already shown.
I'm starting just like with the very first model and cutting and machine sewing a bias tube of velvet. The bias velvet tube is the length of the circumference of the pillbox and the height of the measurement from the edge to the middle plus 3 centimeters. Then I'm attaching it to the inside base of the pillbox using running stitches. I'm thinking ahead and attaching my curved Petersham ribbon now. This is to hide the raw edge of the velvet on the inside of the hat. Flip the velvet over the top and here comes the clever bit, the central gather. You need to put in a gather stitch around the circumference of the fabric. My gather stitch is following an elliptical pattern as I want my gathers to sit towards the back of the pillbox rather than right in the centre. I've marked it on using fine pins and then stitched the thread through. The gathers are created by pulling and securing this thread. Once you're happy with the position, cut off the excess fabric. Don't throw it away, put it in a scrap box as these offcuts come in handy when making flowers. Sometimes the gathers need a few extra stitches in strategic places to flatten them down to the buckram base. I've decided to trim this hat with a handmade velvet silk rose. Its positioning hides the point at where the gathers were stitched down to the buckram.
It's that time again when we discuss variations. The gathers need something to conceal them. I have chosen to pop on a large handmade flower onto mine, but you can put on anything you want. As usual, you've got bows, feathers, some veiling, crin, anything goes, as long as you enjoy it.
Here's the last hat. This one is my favourite. It's all about strategically hiding or showing drapes in the velvet. It's really hard to get velvet to sit smoothly over such a steep curve of this pillbox base. The way I'm going to work around this is to plan ahead and mark on my base where I want the inevitable fabric folds to end up. I've planned this into my design and I will be using ribbons to hide these folds. I'm using a bit of silk viscose velvet that I had left over from another hat. I have cut it to an oval on the bias and I'm going to start pinning it to the inside lip of the pillbox. First, I fix on my straight grains. Then I start gently stretching and folding over my bias lines, aligning the folds and pleats with where I put the pencil marks earlier. Once the velvet is all pinned in place, I'm going to pin in my ribbons. This is just to make sure the pleats of the fabric are covered. I have chosen to form an X shape with my ribbons, but there is no reason as to why you couldn't just have them parallel, or maybe even just one ribbon that's wider. The final design is all up to you. And here is the hat. It's not quite finished. It still needs a Petersham ribbon, a fastening and a lining, but I haven't got round to doing this yet. As I've already said, this is my favourite design and I can't wait to finish it and wear it.
And there you have it, 5 different yet similar types of pillboxes. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. This really helps me grow and reach a larger audience. You can support my work on Patreon, where you'll find the missing part of this video about the linings. You can also leave me a tip on Ko-fi, and all the links are in the description box. For more millinery content, you can follow me on Instagram at Ilona Millinery. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.